But I have so many tabs open, I'm kind of in danger of losing where I'm at. Got it. Right. Okay, so even though we're a little tiny bit early, I think we could, potentially get started. I don't want to annoy anyone by being too early, but so give me just a couple of seconds to get ready, and we'll let people continue to filter in. Okay. So I can be telling them about what's happening this week. So on Thursday, for those of you who are with us live in New York, we have Off the Meter presented by John McDonough as part of the Origins Theatre Company's Plays in May series. And John has written a really funny piece about his cabtivism. He was a cab driver for 40 years in New York. So some of the stories about how New York has changed. Of course, he presented a radio show for years with Malachy McCourt. So we'll hear about that. That's here in person at the Society at 7 p.m. You can buy tickets online. And we continue that play series on Monday, May 20th with Dry Rot, which is a comedy written by Don Creedon. And on the 22nd, Wednesday at 7 o'clock, we're presenting Dublin Noir by Honor Malloy. So 3 different plays for you guys. And then on Tuesday, the 21st, we're doing another Zoom where we speak to a young Irish kind of podcaster and TikToker, all this kind of thing, a digital history, the past in the future. And he's going to talk about content creation, misinformation, the digitization of various archives and how exciting, I suppose telling various historical stories can be, but also the pitfalls that are associated with that. And then on May 22nd at 7 o'clock, we're doing an online talk with our resident genealogist up in Albany, but it's open to our audience here in New York too. She's going to talk about finding your Irish ancestors online. And as many of you know, the Irish records in particular are quite good. Everybody's waiting with bated breath for the next census to be revealed and all of that. But there are a lot of parish records online and other baptismal and all those kinds of records. So if you want to kind of figure out how you would start combing your family tree's branches, then on Wednesday on Zoom, we'll be able to do that for you. So I'm going to introduce our panelists tonight. We're delighted to have welcome back with us Dr. Richard Aldous and Dr. Brian Murphy to talk to us about the Good Friday Agreement, the Legacy Act, and kind of the current status and maybe even the future of Northern Ireland. Richard Aldous is the Eugene Meyer Professor of British History and Literature at Bard College. He is a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society and authored or edited 11 books, including Reagan and Thatcher, The Difficult Relationship, The Lion and the Unicorn, Gladstone versus Disraeli, and biographies of Malcolm Sargent and Tony Ryan. He taught for 15 years at UCD, where he was chair of the history department and taught yours truly. And he regularly writes for publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and American Interest, where he's a contributing editor. Brian Murphy then is a lecturer in the College of Arts and Tourism at the Technical University in Dublin. He earned his doctorate in modern Irish history from the School of History and Archives at UCD. And very relevant for us tonight, he was the speechwriter for Bertie Ahern, who of course was Taoiseach at the time of the agreement. So welcome everyone, and thank you both for joining us. Thanks to everybody online with us. So I'll kick it off with kind of an easy one. And for those of you who are on the Zoom, you can access the Q&A feature down here on your screen to submit questions, and I'll go through them and ask the panel. But Brian, can you tell us a little bit about exactly what the Good Friday Agreement was and why it came into being?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it came. Good evening, Elizabeth, and hi, Richard, and hello to our audience as well. I mean, I suppose the Good Friday Agreement, it came out of that conflict that lasted in Northern Ireland, essentially from 1969 right through to 1994, when you had the IRA ceasefire. And I mean, that was a conflict where about 3,700 people were killed in that conflict. You've something like 16,000 bombings, 36,000 shootings, 47,000 people injured, and then an incalculable cost in terms of lost investment, lost trade, lost opportunity. And although that figure of 3,700 lives, that might seem quite small, you're talking about Northern Ireland, which is a population of about 1.8 million, so approximately the same demographic as West Virginia. And I was looking earlier on in terms of the land mass of Northern Ireland, about the same as Connecticut. So in a very small area with a small population, 3,700 people, wiped out with quite a bloody conflict. And I suppose the news cycle at that time, people growing up, whether you're in Ireland, whether you're in the UK, whether you're in the United States, you would have associated Ireland, and particularly Northern Ireland, with bombs, with bullets, with carnage, with mayhem. And the Good Friday Agreement comes out of that conflict. Rages, I suppose, until 1994, and there's an IRA ceasefire. The ceasefire breaks down in 1996, and there's a change of government in the UK in 1997. Tony Blair becomes Prime Minister in the UK, and that same summer, Bertie Ahern is elected Prime Minister in the Republic of Ireland, and a new impetus grows for peace. There's a further IRA ceasefire, and it ultimately does lead to the Good Friday Agreement. And I'm only getting to your question now. What was that agreement? Well, first of all, I suppose there was two parts to the agreement, or two interrelated agreements. It's an agreement, a multi-party agreement between the parties within Northern Ireland. And that was important, that you would have all the political parties, all the political players in Northern Ireland on the same page. To get that agreement was historic. The DUP, Ian Paisley's party, they actually remained outside the parameters of the Good Friday Agreement until 2006, but that's much further down the line. And the other part of the Good Friday Agreement is it is an international agreement between Britain and Ireland. And that is quite relevant in terms of what's going on today with Brexit. We may come to that later on. And then the agreement itself, and how it was brought about, that the negotiation in terms of when it was brought about, there was almost what became a catchphrase that nothing was agreed until everything was agreed. And there was three strands, and the three strands had to be agreed before there was a final agreement. There was strand one, which was essentially the internal affairs of Northern Ireland. And that was to get an agreement on a system of government for Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom. And that established a Northern Ireland Assembly, and it established a Northern Ireland Executive. It was a devolved government, and crucially, it was a power-sharing government where nationalists and loyalists, or nationalists and unionists, Republicans and loyalists, where they actually shared power. And how portfolios were handed out within the Northern Ireland Executive, they used what was known as the D'Hondt system, which is quite complicated in terms of, there's a quite complicated mathematical formula for how ministries are handed out, but essentially it's a proportional representation of seats at the cabinet table. And that meant that nearly every political party got some representation within the executive of Northern Ireland, and that was important in terms of bringing everybody on board. Strand two was the north-south dimension, and that was very important to the Irish government, because the Irish government, as part of the Good Friday Agreement, were going to give up Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution, Bunreacht na hÉireann. Article 2 and 3 were the articles in the Constitution which unionists took offence to, because they saw those articles as making a territorial claim over Northern Ireland. And the Irish government were prepared to set those aside if there was progress on a north-south dimension. And what came out of the agreement eventually, and this wasn't easy to get to, was that there would be north-south cooperation on areas like agriculture, in terms of education, in terms of the environment, in terms of health, in terms of tourism, and that there would be north-south implementation bodies. And we have north-south implementation bodies where there are executive powers in terms of waterways, where there's a Tourism Ireland body which does extraordinary work in terms of marketing Ireland as an island, not in terms of two jurisdictions, but as a whole island around the world. And then those implementation bodies, they look at European Union programs, or at least they did until the British government decided they didn't want to be part of Europe anymore. And then there's North-South bodies on language as well. So that was very, very important to the Irish government. It gave, I suppose, an All-Ireland dimension to politics on the island. And then Strand 3, which was important to people from the Unionist tradition. And Strand 3 essentially is the East-West relationship, and it's the relationship between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom. And out of that came a British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference. One of the things that looks at now, very, very topical, is asylum and immigration. And you also have the British-Irish Council, which is quite an interesting body, because one school of thought to the solution, one school of thought that might have argued in terms of solution to the problems of Northern Ireland and partition would be that the Republic of Ireland goes back into the Commonwealth, and there's probably not much appetite for that in the Republic of Ireland. And the idea of a British-Irish Council, which comprises of representatives of the Government of Ireland, representatives of the Government of the United Kingdom, and then representatives of the devolved government of Northern Ireland, the devolved government of Scotland, the devolved government of Wales, and then the British Crown dependencies of the Isle of Man, Jersey, and Guernsey. And what that does is that British-Irish Council looks at issues of mutual interest around education, around common travel, around engagement with Europe as well. And it's quite an influential body. And although it was set up, I think, in terms of for unionist concerns, it's something that the Irish government have found very, very useful, very, very useful as well. So that is the agreement in a nutshell. But to actually get there was a different story. It was very, very long, drawn out process.
Mm-hmm. Richard, as Brian kind of alluded to there, possibly some of the impetus for actually getting people to the table, aside from the Clinton administration here, and of course Senator Mitchell's involvement, was the change of government in England. So can you talk a little bit about, how important the Labour Party's election success was, and a little bit about, Trimble and the fact that, as he said, the DUP did not get involved. So what was the unionist approach in the north of Ireland to this?
First of all, Elizabeth, can I say what a pleasure it is to be here? Congratulations to you on your new appointment at the American Irish Historical Society, building on the fantastic work that you'd already been doing in Albany. And certainly it does make me very proud remembering you as a student at UCD, to see how accomplished you've become. And also it's such a pleasure to be on with Brian. I think that everybody can hear from that answer just how detailed and knowledgeable Brian is on this, that as you said, he was a speechwriter to Bertie Ahern. So the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement is something that he was intimately involved in, writing some of the most important public utterances kind of on British-Irish relations, including the speech that Bertie Ahern, historic speech that he made in the British Parliament. So, for everybody here today, but also for me personally, it's wonderful to be able to contribute to this discussion with Brian on the call as such an expert. In terms of the British politics, I think that the first thing to say actually is to just slightly revise the question as you asked it, because one of the people who really doesn't get very much credit for Good Friday, the Northern Ireland peace process, is of course the defeated Prime Minister in that 1997 general election, that John Major really was a pivotal figure in getting the process started, the Downing Street Declaration, the very difficult process of trust, building trust with the Irish government, working with Albert Reynolds, as Brian talked about, kind of edging the IRA towards a ceasefire, and the importance of that in trust building, the very tentative discussions and back channel discussions that went on. So I think that, you know, Major's part was very important. And so it meant that when Tony Blair came to power in 1997, a lot of the initial work and a lot of the difficult work had already been done. And Blair, to his credit, has always acknowledged that and the importance of the Major government. I think it is important that Tony Blair won a massive landslide in that election because it gave him an authority in the country, but also with a huge majority in the parliament. It gave him a lot more room for maneuver than he otherwise would have had. And one of the things that I think quite often gets overlooked in all of this is that Blair's interest in Ireland and attachment to Ireland was not just political, it was personal. That he had spent time in Ireland as a child. He had connections through his family. His wife came from Liverpool. There's a kind of Catholic background and Irish background there. So there were a lot of personal things going on with Tony Blair that meant that he was genuinely invested in Ireland. And I think that is something that has not always been true of British prime ministers when it comes to dealing with Ireland and particularly dealing with the North. That there's been you can argue, and some have argued, that one of the reasons that the Troubles spin out of control in the 1960s and 1970s is because Britain just did not have its eye on that particular ball, and only realized too late that this was going to escalate in the way that it did. So I think with Blair, what you see is that kind of personal, and then that turning to the political, the fact that he has an ideological affinity with Bill Clinton, the American president, that they're both part of this kind of progressive center-left politics that is kind of turning away from the left of their own parties. So they're already working together, and kind of Ireland is something that they're both interested in. And then, of course, the trio emerges the following year when Bertie Ahern is elected. And I think perhaps slightly to the surprise of both men, they actually turn out to get along very well together. And although, you know, as Brian indicated there on issues like the Bloody Sunday inquiry and so on, they were not afraid to have really very serious confrontations with each other. There was underlying that a very definite trust and a personal liking, I think. And so all of those things I think, kind of came together in a way that was fortuitous.
Mm-hmm. We just had a question about the play that's currently on, Agreement, at the Irish Arts Centre, asking if you had seen it, and if you had, what you thought about the portrayal. So I said you hadn't, but it's interesting when you're talking about, you know, the characters involved and not only, you know, are you waiting for personalities to kind of get together and to work together, which was very, I thought, skillfully done in the play, but, you know, Brian, the whole idea of advocating like for your side, you know, and so obviously everyone came into those talks, you know, with very, very specific, you know, needs that had to be met, or like a cohort behind them that are arguing for certain things. So, you know, this idea of getting to a compromise, do you know, what that was like in the room? How difficult was it for all of these men and Mo Mowlam, you know, to try to navigate not only their own constituents, but, you know, the future and the possibilities that was ahead of them?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, I mean, it was Edmund Burke, I think, who said that the foundation of all government is a process of barter and compromise, and that's ultimately what the agreement was. Nobody got everything they wanted, out of it. I mean, I think the big surprise was that there was an agreement in the end, and that comes down to history, often comes down to personalities as well. I'm a real believer in terms of the personalities that were there, in terms of Bill Clinton, Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern. And as Richard said, there was a bond between them. I was privileged to see them all last April, April of last year in Belfast, when there was a gathering for the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and the camaraderie and the bond between them is very, very strong. And maybe that's because they've achieved something. But I even think at the stage that they were in their careers, they were, political leaders in their 40s, young, dynamic, and there was a real energy to the three of them. But just to step back for a second, I mean, to take Richard's point as well, because I think it's a really, really important point in terms of what John Major had done, and even to go back a little bit further, as sometimes historians do. But I was reminded when you were reading out or giving Richard's background and talking about the book that he wrote, very fine book he wrote about Reagan and Thatcher and their difficult relationship. And I think Mrs. Thatcher, her relationship, however difficult it was with Ronald Reagan, it was much more difficult with Ireland. And I think, not to get into what's if, down that tunnel of what's if of history, but if Mrs. Thatcher had stayed in office beyond 1990, and stayed longer, I'm not sure there would have been a modern peace process. She certainly had a lot of baggage around Ireland, dating back from hunger strikes and possibly from the Brighton bombing as well. And I think when she does get off the pitch, and to talk about John Major comes in as Prime Minister, and doesn't have the same constraints maybe as Mrs. Thatcher has. On the Irish side, not just to talk all about Bertie Ahern, Charles Haughey, who was Prime Minister up until 1992, he essentially starts the peace process where he instructs his advisor, Dr. Martin Manser, to reach out to the IRA, and that's done with the assistance of Dermot Ahern, who was a border Fianna Fáil TD from the border area of Louth, and Father Alex Reid, a Redemptorist priest in Belfast. And they start talking to the IRA. John Hume was involved in this, about the potential of a ceasefire and where this can lead. And then when Albert Reynolds becomes Taoiseach, himself and John Major have a bond, because when Reynolds had been Minister of Finance, John Major had been Chancellor of the Exchequer, and there was a good relationship between them, and they trusted each other. And a lot of what the Good Friday Agreement comes down to, and the peace process is, it comes down to that word trust. But there was a trust between Reynolds and Major that led to the IRA ceasefire in 1994. John Bruton then succeeds Reynolds as Taoiseach, and there are some difficult days there, particularly when the IRA go back to conflict, and then when Bertie Ahern does come in, and to say, that Bill Clinton was there, Tony Blair was there, and Bertie Ahern was there, that made an agreement inevitable. It certainly didn't, because I don't think that week in April 1998, I don't think anyone thought there was going to be an agreement. I think there was a poll done in the Belfast Telegraph on the week of the talks and the agreement, early in the talks, and only 5% of people thought that there would be an agreement. I know that Bertie Ahern himself, he was skeptical enough that there would be an agreement, but didn't necessarily show that, and said, look, this is an opportunity. We have to give this everything that we have got. And, sometimes outside events help things as well, in terms of Bertie Ahern was dealing with a personal tragedy at that time, because his own mother had passed away right as the negotiations started. And actually, he travelled down from the talks to attend his mother's removal, travelled back up for talks again, then travelled down for the funeral, and travelled up immediately after the funeral in terms of the negotiations. And having talked to people who were unionist politicians at that time, who maybe initially didn't trust Bertie Ahern as leader of Fianna Fáil, the Republican Party, and might have been suspicious of maybe Irish irredentist nationalism as they would have seen it, but they came to believe that this guy was sincere about peace, and they admired his courage in terms of those talks. And Tony Blair, you know, whatever people think about him subsequently in terms of Iraq, he was a great salesman in terms of politics. And even at the start of those talks, when nobody believed they would succeed, Tony was talking about the hand of history, talking to people about the opportunity that was there and not to let that opportunity pass. And thankfully, people did grasp that anyway, but there were long, drawn out, hard negotiations to get there.
Mhm.
I think
And so-
that's a point. If I could just
Yeah.
kind of follow up on that, I do think that is an important point that Brian has just made there, because without wanting to get into all of the debates around the Iraq War and weapons of mass destruction and so on, and Tony Blair's kind of historical legacy in that regard,
Mm.
I think it's really important to remember how he was seen in 1997. That, I mean, he was one of the most popular prime ministers that Britain has ever had electorally. He was also one of the most popular prime ministers in terms of public opinion polls and so on. So, you know, he at the time of the Good Friday Agreement, he had considerable political clout, both politically and in terms of his kind of popular, the way he was held by kind of ordinary people, and you know that does matter, and it comes back to the point that Brian made about Margaret Thatcher. After all, she did negotiate an agreement on Northern Ireland, the Hillsborough Agreement, as Edward Heath earlier had negotiated an agreement with at Sunningdale. So
Yeah.
these agreements had been delivered before, but almost before they even started, there was already a sense of mistrust, of kind of things falling out of sync, of different parties not being brought on board, and so on. And so I think, you know, again, we come back to that, you know, some of it is the kind of political hard graft that Brian was talking about, and real skill and kind of in the moment. But there is also this kind of serendipity, kind of including, as I said earlier, the fact that, you know, you think about 1997, that, you know, Bill Clinton makes his second presidential address, beginning his second term as president in January. Blair is elected in May of 97, and then Bertie Ahern that summer. So, you know, these three leaders in place and secure, all with, you know, kind of strong mandates that kind of then is able to translate into having real political leverage.
And could I add to that, Richard? Because I mean, we've talked about Clinton and Blair and Bertie Ahern as well, but I think the other great leader in the Good Friday Agreement negotiations was George Mitchell. We were talking, Elizabeth, before we came on, in terms of along the same lines as your questioner had in terms of that play agreement. I haven't seen it either. I don't know how George Mitchell is portrayed in that play, but I mean, he certainly was one of the heroes of the Good Friday Agreement. And I think, you know, when he comes to when he comes to Ireland, first of all, in 1995 as US Special Envoy, and he said since he was contemplating retirement, he was 62 years of age when he came to Northern Ireland in 1995. He had a career as a legal career. He'd been a lawyer, he'd been a judge, then he ended up in politics. He'd been Senate Majority Leader. And was really thought he was winding down at that stage. He gets the call from Bill Clinton. He's asked to be US Special Envoy, and he ends up spending, you know, the best part of 3 years of his life, when he thought he was going to be winding down, back and forth between Northern Ireland, spending months on end in Northern Ireland. And that took real patience, because when he first arrived in Northern Ireland, some of the parties did not want to even accept him in terms of as an envoy, and he had to convince them of his bona fides. When the talk started, to get everybody to the table, to get people even to the table together, not mind reach any agreement.
Mhm.
Again, Mitchell had to show incredible political skills. He had got married in 1994 for the second time before he came to Northern Ireland, and just before the negotiations, the Good Friday Agreement, his second wife gave birth to their child. And although he had showed incredible patience, personally, having spent the best part of 3 years on and off in Northern Ireland, he wanted to get home.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
you know, and he said, I know he said to Bertie Ahern, he said, we need to impose a deadline here.
Yeah.
We need to bring this to a head, because he said we could spend the next 2 or 3 years talking, and people
Yeah.
in the talks being out of the talks, being expelled from the talks. And he said, we have to give this a deadline, will give this focus. So
Yeah.
ultimately, his patience to bring everybody together, but then his impatience to get a deal done. And that deadline did give things focus, and it was the right political decision. And then in
Then
terms
you
of
could have talks about talks, you know.
you could have
I
talks
just
about
want to move
talks.
us on from the agreement itself to, if you don't mind,
Sure.
because we are pressed for time. Richard, will you talk a little bit about how Brexit complicated the issue? You know, so we understand, you know, that there was massive compromises on everyone's side, but then Brexit is a huge, even though it was, you know, almost 20 years later, big spanner in the works.
Yeah, because so much, as Brian indicated in his first answer, so much of the Good Friday Agreement was predicated on the fact that Britain and Ireland were both members of the European Union. And it meant that, you know, things like, for example, freedom of movement within the European Union meant that you could elide or fudge many of the kind of the complicated questions, particularly around identity. So, for example, and actually Brian would be able to speak with more authority on this, but on questions of passports, that one of the things that the Good Friday Agreement allows people to do is to identify and have their citizenship as being British, or to be Irish, or to be both. And that within the European Union, because both of those countries you were a citizen of the European Union, in a way, it didn't really matter. It was a personal choice for you, but in practical terms, it meant that you could still do whichever choice you made, you could still move between the countries, you could still move around Europe and so on. Of course, with Brexit, when Britain withdraws from the European Union, suddenly everything becomes complicated, because there is a border between, in fact, it's the only land border between Britain and the European Union, is right there on one of the historically most sensitive and complicated borders that you could possibly imagine. So that, you know, when you start thinking about freedom of movement of peoples, of goods, of services, and so on, there has to be some kind of border between the two countries. But how do you do that without kind of reigniting so many of the issues that had been there during the Troubles? So, you know, that's why, you know, it was such a thorny issue during negotiations. Eventually, of course, they ended up with the Windsor Framework, which, you know, seems to be working within within reason. But we've seen recently the kind of complications that it can throw up around, for example, the question of migration. Britain has the British Parliament recently passed legislation saying that illegal immigrants into the UK could be transported to Rwanda in a deal that was signed with that country. So many illegal immigrants, and actually many legal ones too, for fear of being moved to Rwanda, are now kind of crossing the border into Ireland, and that has created a political kind of issue within Ireland itself, as I understand it, but certainly between the two countries. I think it is just worth saying as a caveat too, that this was not discussed as an issue during the Brexit referendum. That Ireland
Immigration.
was
Oh,
not an
yeah,
issue. It was an afterthought.
yeah,
And I think that, on one level, that shows you how successful the Good Friday Agreement had been, that most people had just kind of put it in a box over here as a kind of a problem solved. The whole issues kind of around Northern Ireland, but it also shows how careless I think kind of Britain had become about the kind of the legacy of Good Friday, the implementation of Good Friday, because very, very quickly it became front and center as one of the thorniest issues in Britain's leaving.
yeah. And you could kind of argue, I suppose, that Ireland was lucky in a way that Europe bolstered our position in terms of, what was law, where were the borders, that the Good Friday Agreement would stand as international law. Brian Paul has just asked, he said, I was surprised when I read Gerry Adams' op-ed in the New York Times a few weeks ago that after the Brexit vote in 2016, when he said it would lead to a united Ireland, it appears that might happen. To what extent will the Good Friday Agreement, as well as Brexit, be seen as leading to a united Ireland? And do you think that hardcore loyalists will take up arms to prevent it on the basis that might have been how the IRA, were successful, at least as the loyalists see it?
Yeah, well, I certainly hope that hardcore loyalists wouldn't do that. And I'll come to the issue of United Ireland in a minute, but I do think, Brexit, trying to be as diplomatic as I can be here, but it's hard to be, because Brexit, in my view, was just bad politics. It was bad for Ireland, which is my primary interest, but I think it's bad for Britain as well. It's bad for Europe, and to me it's just poor politics. And whatever about it leading to United Ireland, it might lead to a disunited kingdom. Because if you look back on that Brexit vote, Northern Ireland had voted to remain as part of the European Union, and Scotland, where there had been a referendum previous to the Brexit referendum in 2014, and the Scottish referendum, initially the independence referendum, looked like it was going to be an independence vote until maybe the last week of the campaign, where there was an issue in terms of would an independent Scotland get into the European Union, and that certainly caused a wobble in Scotland. There was other issues around Stirling as well that caused a wobble in Scotland. But this idea that Scotland might be, if it voted itself outside of the United Kingdom, it would not be in the European Union. That encouraged Scottish people to remain within the United Kingdom. And then 2 years later, there's a Brexit referendum where the Scottish people vote strongly. Where the Scottish people vote strongly to remain. They want to remain within the European Union. But what happens is the sizable majority in England, where there's a bigger population, that takes Scotland out of the European Union. And I do think, I think British elections are going to be interesting because I think there are tensions there. I think there is a push in Scotland for a second independent referendum as well. To go back to where Paul is in terms of a united Ireland, I do think that's inevitable, but I don't think it's in the short term. I think it's inevitable in terms of I think it's inevitable in terms of demographics. I don't think Brexit has helped the cause of the union, and I think a lot of people in Northern Ireland, irrespective of whether they're from a unionist or a nationalist tradition, maybe have seen that the interests of Northern Ireland were not as important as where some Brexiteers had their view of the United Kingdom's place in the world. I mean, the issues that it's caused in terms of the border, the difficulties it's now creating in terms of North-South cooperation, that unraveling of in terms of citizenship and unraveling in terms of common travel area as well, it really has been problematic. Is you know when the border poll comes, you know, and I don't think it's going to come anytime in the short term. What I'm talking about, the border poll, is there is a provision in the Good Friday Agreement, I think Article 1.2 or Article 1.3, where there is provision where there can be a poll where the people of Northern Ireland can vote to change the constitutional status. I don't see that happening at any time soon. I know Sinn Féin have sort of made noises that they would like that to happen sooner rather than later. I'm not sure a border poll would actually be carried at the moment. There is a Catholic majority in Northern Ireland in terms of a demographic, but not every Catholic is probably going to vote for a united Ireland. But that Catholic majority, it isn't a voting majority yet. A lot of them are under the age of 18. But inevitably, the way the demographics and the projections are, you are going to have, at some stage, maybe 10, 12, 15 years, you are going to have, the numbers are going to be there clearly for a united Ireland, and you would hope.
And Brian, would the numbers be there in the Republic as well? Do you think? Because one of the lessons of the Scottish referendum was that economics really played an important part in that referendum, and you know, it's interesting on kind of Brexit because you could see it going in two different directions. One the way that you just illustrated with Scotland, but also I think Brexit has actually in some ways made Scottish independence less likely because there's no guarantee that an independent Scotland would be admitted to the European Union for fear of what that might say to regions like Catalonia, for example.
Yes, yes.
And also that if the unstitching of an agreement that had only been in place since 1973, Britain's relationship with the European Union, was complicated. Just imagine what unstitching a relationship that goes back at least until 1707 and the two countries being united to form Great Britain, how complicated that would be. And also the worry for Scots is that they could be closed out of English trade, English employment opportunities, which they've always been able to take advantage of. So I think that's kind of complicated. But I am curious on this question of a border poll, whether it would automatically pass in the Republic, because it would mean rather like West Germany taking on responsibility for East Germany, it would mean the Republic of Ireland, a highly successful economic model, taking on as in Northern Ireland, an economy which is deeply flawed, is still industrial rather than post-industrial, high unemployment, kind of taking a large subsidy from the United Kingdom, and so on. So I wonder whether you think that economics would trump sentiment, or whether that kind of opportunity to achieve a kind of historic goal would ultimately see the vote pass.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting debate, Richard, and there was a report published here recently by the ESRI, the Economic and Social Research Institute, done by two academics, Dr. John Fitzgerald, who's a son of the former Taoiseach Gareth Fitzgerald, and a German academic whose name escapes me now at the moment. But the report that they had done was talking about whether we could afford a united Ireland, what it would potentially mean in terms of our taxes, and there has been some criticism of that because it is all obviously projection in terms of how much more tax that we might pay, and yeah, whether sentiment would trump economics on that. I tend to think that the circumstances in terms of where it comes about, and obviously there will be negotiation between the British Exchequer has hugely subsidises Northern Ireland for all of its existence in terms of, and I think any final resolution there, there would certainly be talks in terms of what is the financial settlement. Will there be actually, will the UK government continue to subsidise for a period? It would depend, I suppose, on the governments and what goodwill there is there. The European Union, I think, would have a vested interest as well in resolving that issue and kind of taking something that may have been that may have led to conflict, taking that finally off the table, and again the United States as well. So what would be brought to play in terms of the economics on that? I'm not sure in terms of the circumstances of that. But you're right in terms of there would not, in terms of the provision, in terms of the border poll, it would not just be a vote in Northern Ireland. It would have to be a vote concurrently on the same day in the Republic of Ireland as well. It would be some irony if the North voted to join with the South and the South decided we don't want the North. But I don't think that will happen. But we don't know the circumstances. You know, it is in the gift of the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland to call that border poll when he or she sees fit. But I don't see that happening at any stage soon, because at the moment, even if there was a small nationalist majority, I think you need to, the figures need to be much bigger, because otherwise you're only going to project maybe some of the alienation that nationalists had felt in Northern Ireland. You're going to project that onto the unionist community. And I think the way the demographics are going in the North, there is going to be a groundswell in terms of you know, a decade or so in terms of a united Ireland at that stage. But it's not something that I see happening in the short term.
No, and particularly with Stormont just reopened as well, you know.
Yeah, it is something we need to prepare ourselves for as well, because it won't be just a case of the Republic of Ireland subsuming Northern Ireland. It's going to be a new state, and we're going to have to work out in terms of relationships. We're going to have to look at things like, you know, which may be uncomfortable for people in the Republic of Ireland. Yeah. What is our flag? What is our what is our national anthem? What are the symbols in terms of our state? Because there is a whole British identity that needs to be respected. But if that can be done in a respectful way, you know, I would hope that people in loyalist communities would people in loyalist communities would not be looking at a militant solution to this, because we all know, I mean, the lesson of the Good Friday Agreement and the conflict that we come from is that the militant solution never works for anybody.
Yeah. And Richard, just to bring it up to another thing that's kind of complicating the issue right now, the passage of the Legacy Act and all that legislation, which I believe, you know, the Irish government and possibly a group backed by the European Union are challenging Britain. So they've passed this Legacy Act that, in fact, we won't do any more inquiries. You know, people will be exempt from sort of criminal charges. Can you talk about how that may or may not affect relations, and particularly for different groups, you know, families looking for justice from Ballymurphy or all of these other, you know, where innocent civilians were targeted, or where there was maybe a state cover-up, a British state cover-up of certain elements of UVF kind of trouble. Can you talk to us about that, please?
Yeah, and this, I think it's important to say that this legislation does not move away entirely from inquiry into crimes and so on. There is a body that is being set up that will still investigate kind of crimes, and in some ways, by removing exemptions and so on, some people have argued that there may actually be more criminal prosecutions now. But yeah, I mean, there's no question that it has soured the relationship, and it's kind of, I think it's part of a really an ongoing process since Brexit, actually, of this kind of gradual souring of the kind of relationship and trust which had been built up, as we'd kind of discussed earlier, under the likes of kind of Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair, and eventually bringing in people like Ian Paisley and so on, and building this kind of this big tent, if you like. And I think that one of the things that speaks to actually is actually generational. That when you take somebody like Rishi Sunak, for example, the British Prime Minister, he wasn't even in Parliament for the 2016 Brexit vote. He became I think he became an MP for the first time in 2017, if at that election, if memory serves me right there. But so, this new generation, they don't remember. They certainly don't remember the kind of the troubles, but they don't remember. There's no institutional memory about the complexities of negotiation, how difficult it was, how the negotiation was negotiated, and then let's not forget the 10 years that it took to implement the Good Friday Agreement. So, that whole kind of generation has now passed. And so I think you're kind of beginning to see the lack of that kind of shared memory, that kind of that institutional, that collective sense of what was achieved together. And so the whole thing is beginning to fragment with the kind of results that you can see. And as we said earlier, Brexit has really just doubled down, tripled down on that, on kind of breaking, where so often many of the kind of the disputes or difficulties between the countries could just be sorted out in the margins of EU meetings, as Brian mentioned earlier. Somebody like John Major and Albert Reynolds got to know each other not over questions of Northern Ireland, but because they were both finance ministers meeting at EU finance ministers' meetings on a regular basis, got to know each other. And so, I think the fact that Britain is no longer part of those discussions means that the kind of the easy way to kind of deal with things before they get out of hand, that's disappeared. Just coming back to one other point that Brian made, and really in some ways building out of this, that that question of if the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland were to come together, I think he's right to talk about the importance of international institutions, because there you have the coming together of one part of Ireland that is in the European Union, the other that is not in the European Union, one part of Ireland which is part of NATO, another part which is not part of NATO, and one part that is part of the Commonwealth, another which is not part of the Commonwealth. So, all of, as we've seen through kind of Brexit, and Brian quoted kind of Burke earlier, but kind of Burke always warned about the danger of disruption, that, it's why he believed in evolution rather than revolution, because when you upend things, then it always has unexpected consequences. And we're seeing the unexpected consequences of Brexit, but also if there was a united Ireland, would also have kind of unexpected consequences too.
I think Brexit, Richard, I mean, it is the great disruptor of our modern times, and I would be a little bit worried about, there is sort of a gradual unraveling of that trust that was there in Anglo-Irish relations coming from Brexit. But I mean, there's a row going on at the moment now in terms of immigration, and a row going on about the Legacy Act, and the Irish government are challenging the UK at the European Court of Human Rights, and that's almost unprecedented over the last 25 years. Not to pull on the green jersey, but I do think they are right to challenge it. I don't think, and maybe there's a lack of understanding in terms of there's a lack of understanding, I think, in terms of, you know, and the points have been made in terms of families being entitled to justice, and issues around trust, huge issues around trust. And I mean, we were talking before we came on air in terms of how we got to the Good Friday Agreement. And for Bertie Ahern, a huge thing was, as a young man, before he was ever elected, he witnessed on his television screens the news reports coming in from Bloody Sunday in Derry, which was the day that 13 civilians who were marching for civil rights were shot by members of the Parachute Regiment. And that had a huge impact in nationalist Ireland. And I suppose to make a bad situation worse, the Widgery Tribunal, which was a whitewash, it was a criminal whitewash in my view. And Bertie felt very strongly that this had to be addressed. There wouldn't be trust between the Irish government and the British governments. And in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement, before negotiations had started, he pushed Tony Blair hard. I think they probably had their hardest conversations ever about Bertie was insisting that there had to be an inquiry into, a proper inquiry into what happened on Bloody Sunday. And eventually Tony Blair went there. He was being advised, certainly by probably his securocrats and some of his officials, not to go there. He said to Bertie at one stage, what if I can't do this? And Bertie said, well, give me a ring in 10 years. So that's how serious it was in terms of trust. But Blair took that leap, and there was that huge trust between them both afterwards, between both sides. And it came back to actually doing the right thing in terms of victims of violence as well. And, you know, since Brexit, there hasn't been that trust between Leo Varadkar and Rishi Sunak, Simon Harris and Rishi Sunak as well. I do think, you know, looking at the Legacy Act, and I have to confess, I haven't read the whole legislation, but I have looked in terms of who's against it. And I just jotted down here, the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, all the political parties in Northern Ireland, all the political parties in Dáil Éireann in the Irish Parliament, Amnesty International, and the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, they are all against this Legacy Act. So that's quite a list. If they're all against it, I think, without reading it, I tend to be against it myself. But the suggestion that it is going to limit criminal investigations, you know, and undoubtedly it was a dirty war, but ultimately how we get to reconciliation is by truth and justice as well. So I think the Legacy Act is it's a bad day. It's a bad day's work. But you know, when it has come to the stage where our government have to take the British government to the European Court of Human Rights, relations aren't good at the moment.
And I think
that's sad.
And I think that's an interesting question, isn't it? Because whatever about the rights or wrongs of the Legacy Act, you know, clearly by the Irish government taking this to the European Court of Human Rights is escalating the problem. It's causing it's emphasizing the rift between the two governments, as you rightly said, Brian, with kind of Bertie Ahern. There were hard conversations that were had between the two leaders. This was something that was dealt at that level rather than resorting to the court. So, you know, I think, as I say, without discussing the rights or wrongs of it, from a tactical point of view, in terms of the reaction that it's likely to inspire in Britain, that seems to me to be something which is likely to exacerbate a lack of trust rather than to rebuild bridges.
And it probably comes back to Richard as well, in terms of what we spoke about at the start, in terms of the personalities. And there was, you know, politicians, sometimes they gel with each other, sometimes they don't. And certainly, you know, Bertie and Blair, you throw in Bill Clinton as well, they seem to gel, they seem to understand each other. You know, and there certainly isn't seem to be that relationship at the moment where the hard conversations can be had, the hard conversations can be had, and where people don't feel then that they have to retreat into hardened positions, that those hard conversations can be had, and that a solution can be found. I mean, I would say the Irish government have probably felt that they have no option but to do this, but it's sad that it's come to this in terms of the relationships between Ireland and Britain, and kind of with so many years of the two governments being on the same page. But it is back to I think the roots of this are in that great disruptor that is Brexit.
Yeah. And so just to kind of wrap it up, and particularly given what's going on, on the other side of the world at the moment, years ago at Fordham, I was at a conference that was, or a panel discussion that was a Palestinian and an Israeli historian who worked together, over 20 years, trying to educate about the problems there. And one of the comments made was something about, Palestinians have no choice but to compromise, and Israel has no need to compromise. And so if we look at the Good Friday Agreement, in terms of building trust, but also compromising and, agreeing to come to the table, do you think there are lessons that the Northern Irish and British experience can teach or can be used in other arenas? Or, were we fortunate, as you said, Brian, 3,700 people when we've had 35,000 killed in 7 months? Is the Palestinian conflict, for instance, too big a problem to try to use this model, do you think? Review. I'll throw that in there.
Yeah, I mean, why we got to an agreement in 1998 was, without getting into Palestine and Israel, but I mean, at the moment, I'm not sure that there is, they've got to the point where, certainly Israel, where they've got to the point where they might be war weary. What happened in Northern Ireland, a long conflict, 25 years of conflict, up to 1994, then the conflict breaks for about 16, 18 months, then it resumes again for a number of months, and then eventually a lasting ceasefire in 1997. But by that stage, people were totally war weary. Maybe we didn't recognize it at the time, but the loyalist paramilitaries have probably realized that the conflict was a zero-sum game. For Sinn Féin and the IRA, they'd fought this long war, and some of the leaders who were young men in the 60s and the 70s, they were becoming not only fathers but grandfathers, and didn't want to hand this conflict on. So there comes a point where people decide, okay,
enough is enough.
Enough is enough. And I think we had hit that point. We were lucky then when we hit that point that the political leadership was there that could actually take this war weariness and bring it to a point where it became an agreement, and then had the perseverance to stay with that agreement and actually get it implemented. Because as Richard alluded to there, I mean, the Good Friday Agreement was signed in 1998, but it wasn't until the St. Andrews Agreement in 2006 and then into 2007 that it really began to be implemented, and it was stop, start, stop, stop, start. So, yeah, I mean, at the moment, is there a will in the conflict in the Middle East for it to stop? At the moment, I pray to God that there is that will, that it will stop. But at the moment, I don't see that. I don't see that. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be a 25-year conflict, but
it's been a 75-year conflict, you could argue.
Yes, but there has to be a will on all sides, I think, and I think eventually that came in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, and Richard, just on that, without putting you too much on the spot, I suppose the fact as well that America did get involved as a sort of a neutral party was instrumental for change in Northern Ireland, and we don't appear to have an outsider, at the moment, who will be neutral. Yeah,
I mean, there's as Brian talked about. I mean, the role of the United States, this kind of tandem of leadership from the very top with the president, allied to somebody on the ground who the president trusted, very experienced politician who was able to kind of do the kind of the hard yards, if you like. Yeah, absolutely crucial. And I think that certainly in terms of the current crisis is clearly complicated by the fact that this is an election year. I referred to the fact that Clinton had just been re-elected. He kind of won the election in 96. So by the time that kind of that Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair come, they are all kind of secure. I mean, obviously, Bill Clinton there'll be the whole Monica Lewinsky kind of thing, but there is a sense of their stability. Whereas the fact that this crisis in the Middle East has erupted during the middle of an election campaign, that Joe Biden, whose instincts, I think his initial reaction showed, was very much to stand with Israel, but is very aware of his left flank, if you like. It was interesting that Mark Penn in the New York Times a day or so ago was arguing actually that's the wrong position for him to take, because he's vacating the center ground. But it just shows how complicated this question becomes when it gets tied in with American politics during an election year.
Yeah.
And I think that point, Richard, that you make is a really good one in terms of the electoral cycle, and that Clinton was just into a second term. He was secure. That Bertie Ahern and Tony Blair had just been elected, the respective prime ministers, and were just setting out on a new term, weren't thinking about another election for at least a couple of years, because even the thorny issues that are going on in Anglo-Irish relations at the moment, they are exacerbated by the fact that we are in an election cycle as well. There's going to be a British election by early 2025, and there's going to be an Irish election by early 2025 as well. So even some of the difficulties that we're having, this row that we're having over immigration and the fallout from the Rwanda bill and how that's going to impact on Ireland, and that's all feeding into the electoral tensions and people trying to resolve that issue in terms of playing to their own political demographic and their own electoral ambitions as well. So undoubtedly, while democracy is great, elections can sometimes complicate things as well.
Yeah. Well, guys, I know we had a hard stop at 7, so thank you for going over. Thank you both so much, Dr. Murphy and Dr. Aldous. I think this was amazing. Unfortunately, we didn't really solve the world's problems, but that's the joy of being historians instead of politicians. We get to just analyze things. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we're back, as I say, next week with some Zooms, and on Thursday here in New York, if you want to come to the play, you're more than welcome to. We'll have John McDonough doing his Off the Meter. We'll have to do this again, because I think I'm left with more questions than I am answers, and keep an eye on things as the election cycle heats up. My God, it'll be interesting. So thanks very much, everyone, and have a great night.
Thanks a million. Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks, Richard. Good to see you. Take care,
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Brian.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thanks,
Bye.